Spotlight, lectures and performances on and around Albany State University.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Devonna Mallory, and this is the 5th Annual Women's Studies Symposium. I teach English here, and I'm the chair of the ASU Gender Studies Committee. Today, we have our second keynote speaker, Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall. She started her career as one of the major forces of the Black feminist movement in the 1960s. She entered Spelman College at the age of 16, and also this is where she majored in English and minored in secondary education. After graduation, she attended Wellesley College for a 5th year of study in English, and then she received her master's degree in English from Atlanta University, which is now Clark Atlanta. She earned her PhD from Emory University. Among her achievements, Dr. Guy-Sheftall co-edited the first anthology on Black women's literature, Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature. She also is the founding co-editor of SAGE, a scholarly journal of Black women. Currently, she is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center at Spelman College and is the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies there as well. So please give a big round of applause for Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall.
I always say when I have students in the audience, which I'm always delighted to do that, I want to talk about 35 minutes. Is that okay? So I'm preparing you for, about a 30 or 35 minute talk. I want to thank ASU's Gender Studies Committee for having invited me to participate in what is now your annual Women's Studies Symposium. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Hill, who's sitting right there in the back, Chair of English, Modern Languages, and Mass Communications, and of course, Dr. Mallory, coordinator of your Women's Studies program. When I was asked to serve as one of the keynote speakers during your symposium and talk about women's studies, I was delighted for a number of reasons. The Women's Center and the Women's Studies program at Spelman College celebrated its 31st birthday in 2012. So I know how important it is to pause, engage in serious reflection, and take notice about how the field of women's studies continues to evolve. There is, of course, a growing body of work which assesses the field of women's studies, now almost 40 years old. If we use as a starting point 1969, the launching of the first program at San Diego State University. Among the retrospectives I looked at for this talk, one in particular, an anthology, Women's Studies for the Future, raised the most compelling questions for me. What is the subject of women's studies? How does women's studies negotiate the politics of alliance and the politics of difference? How can women's studies fulfill its promise of interdisciplinarity? What is the continuing place of activism in women's studies? And finally, how has feminist pedagogy responded to changing social conditions? Initially, my desire was to organize this talk around how I might answer these questions. From my particular location as the founding director of the only Women's Research Center and Women's Studies program at a historically Black college. The Spelman College Women's Research and Resource Center, founded in 1981, is also the only women's institute in the academy, majority or minority colleges, which has an LGBTQ program, an archival program, a student activist leadership project, linkages with universities and NGOs around the African diaspora, a digital media project, a global women's health initiative, and a commitment to becoming a major repository for materials on Black women in higher education and contemporary Black feminist movement. Though I was tempted to answer the questions posed by the editors of Women's Studies, I decided instead to craft a more personal narrative. I wanted to reflect more deeply upon why I was drawn to women's studies in the first place, why I'm still passionate about the field, despite all its challenges, and why I think it's important for young women and men to hear about the joys of feminism and the life we chose as women's studies scholars and activists. In many ways, the genealogy of my own professional life provides a glimpse into the transformative impact of women's studies and feminist politics on those of us who came of age in the 60s. I can say without question that my involvement in the development of the field simply changed my life. Unlike many feminist academics, however, I decided to do my intellectual political work not at a majority institution, but at a historically Black college for women, whose evolving mission I wanted to help shape. In 1974, 3 years after I joined the faculty at Spelman College as a member of the English department, I met Toni Cade Bambara, who was to have the most profound impact on my career as a feminist scholar activist. Because of the significance of her anthology, The Black Woman, published in 1970, which I hope you will get a chance to know about, and her importance as a writer, scholar, educator, critic, and community worker, I decided to interview Toni in her Atlanta home for Sturdy Black Bridges, my first publication, which was co-edited with Roseanne Bell, my English department colleague. Though I would never have been able to anticipate Toni's impact, this first meeting was pivotal in my evolving feminist consciousness. When I inquired about the possibility of Black and other third world women forming alliances around the eradication of both race and gender oppression, Toni revealed her involvement in what we would now call a global women's movement. A year later, 1975, Toni would actually travel to North Vietnam, having been invited by their Women's League with a delegation called the North American Academic Marxist, Leninist, Anti-Imperialist Feminist Women. When she said this, I didn't even know what she was talking about. I was 25 years old. She believed the feminist movement should not be narrowly focused on the evils of patriarchy, but rather on eliminating all oppressions, including those experienced by colonized third world people and poor people in the US. She also bemoaned a missed moment in the early 1960s, when what she called a national Black women's movement could have been multicultural and multi-ethnic. If African American women had joined Puerto Rican women and Chicanos in their struggles for liberation. When I asked her whether it was a dilemma for her to be both a feminist and a warrior in the race struggle, which for some Black women and men was an oxymoron, she asserted unequivocally, "I don't find any basic contradiction or any tension between being a feminist, being a Pan-Africanist, being a Black nationalist, being an internationalist, being a socialist, and being a woman in North America." This was precisely the message that many of us young Black feminists needed as we found ourselves increasingly under suspicion with respect to our race loyalty. My decision 2 years later to enroll in a particular doctoral program at Emory University, the Institute for Liberal Arts, was connected to the kind of scholar activist I wanted to become, and I was definitely influenced by Toni. I chose Emory's American Studies program rather than the PhD in English because I could pursue my evolving interests in both African American studies and women's studies, and because I knew the ILA to be an oppositional space within American higher education, a place where interdisciplinarity was at the core of the program, where transgressive intellectual work would be supported, and where young scholars like myself, especially young Black women scholars, would never have to apologize for our interests in both race and gender, or struggle for our voices to be heard. I also wanted to involve myself in the kind of intellectual and political work that Toni Cade Bambara's life represented. I should also say that in memory of Tony Cade, the Women's Center at Spelman has an annual Tony Cade conference the third week in March, so it's coming up soon. I left Emory after 5 years with a serious commitment to continue my scholarly work on Black women, which began with a U.S. focus, but now encompasses the experiences of women of African descent globally. Shortly after Emory established the first doctoral program in women's studies, I was invited to teach as an adjunct professor, during which I developed 2 courses which had a tremendous impact on my research interests. A course called African American Women's History, and a course called African American Feminist Thought, which actually resulted in the publication of that book that I still like very much, Words of Fire, an anthology of African American feminist thought, which New Press published in 1995, and which it still keeps in print. My evolving interest in Black feminist studies and its global dimensions led to my moving away from teaching graduate courses at Emory University that focused narrowly on the U.S. While the field of women's studies was also becoming more global, women in Africa and the African diaspora were still largely invisible as scholars or subjects for classroom study. Despite the pervasiveness of Western feminist theory in women's studies classrooms, I was becoming increasingly aware of the growing body of creative, scholarly, and political work by African and African-descended women that should be placed under the rubric of African feminisms. After looking at this outpouring of Black feminist intellectual production over the past 2 decades in Africa, the US, Canada, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Black Britain, I decided that I would broaden my own research interests and start teaching courses called Third World Feminisms and Global Black Feminisms, which I still do. In order to continue to participate in the transformation of women's studies, the Women's Center at Spelman has engaged in broader feminist networks, again catalyzed by Tony, and hosted an international conference on women, girls, and HIV/AIDS in Africa and the African diaspora, which attracted delegations from South Africa, Senegal, and Brazil. This was actually the first gathering at a Black college to discuss both the racial and gender dimensions of the pandemic. Our evolving work on African feminisms has resulted in our establishing collaborations with women all over the continent of Africa. In January 2005, we took a delegation of faculty and students to South Africa to attend their Writing African Women, Politics and Poetics of African Gender Research, which was a conference at the University of the Western Cape. In October 2005, a group of feminist scholars from Brazil, the Caribbean, traveled to Atlanta to the Women's Center, and we gathered there for a week. One result of that historic gathering was the idea to host a faculty seminar at Spelman called New Research and Discourse on Gender and Sexuality in the African Diaspora, which took place on the Spelman campus in 2007. The readings represented the perspectives of Black feminist intellectuals and others located differentially throughout Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. It was a very exciting gathering. We identified and explored the emerging themes and directions of this growing body of scholarship from an interdisciplinary, intersectional, transnational, historical, and critical feminist perspective. The seminar's intellectual center applied to a range of recent events and areas of inquiry that included the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, wars and militarization, human rights, neoliberal globalization, and expressions of alternative sexualities in particular cultural contexts. On a personal level, I have continued to collaborate with other women of color in order to deepen my own understanding of the global realities of women, as well as become more engaged in networks away from the Spelman campus that have been deeply satisfying and intellectually engaging. In this regard, for example, Professor Chandra Talpati Mohanty, which is why I'm wearing these clothes today. And I have been teaching summer faculty development seminars at New York University's Faculty Resource Network to a remarkably diverse group of faculty from the U.S. and the Americas. And in fact, in just a few weeks, we'll do another one. Notwithstanding these exciting off-campus feminist collaborations, a disappointment for me surrounds the issue of the institutionalization of women's studies in the academy. Despite the fact that there are over now 600 undergraduate women's studies programs in the U.S. and a growing number of doctoral programs, I think we're now at 15, women's studies is still institutionally fragile in most places. In a sense that, in the sense that most women's studies programs, for example, do not have departmental status and are therefore without their own faculty lines. They also have inadequate budgets and very little control over their curriculum because they depend on departmental courses or joint appointments. There has also been in recent years a tremendous backlash against women's studies and feminism and a tightening of resources so that though women's studies is visible in the academy and has had a tremendous impact, it is not as institutionally strong as it would be the case in most traditional departments or disciplines. After 40 years of involvement with women's studies, which actually began when I was writing a thesis on Faulkner's treatment of women in his major novels at Atlanta University, I am as committed to this interdisciplinary field as I was when I enrolled in my first women's studies course as a doctoral student at Emory in 1976. I remain active in the women's movement nationally and internationally, and I continue to engage in interdisciplinary scholarship that falls under the rubric of Black feminist studies. In this regard, I continue to document, when I have some time, and analyze the feminist theorizing and political activism of women of African descent, no matter where they live. In the aftermath of our 25th anniversary at Spelman, which we define very explicitly and proudly as Black feminist space, we celebrated the life and work of Audre Lorde. Through struggle, strategic resistance, perseverance, and clarity of vision about our work, we reflected upon not just the kind of program we had crafted, but upon what often goes unnoticed and sometimes gets us in big trouble. In a world that appears to be falling, and I'll talk about a little bit of that if I have some time. I'll talk about the big trouble we're in right now. In a world that appears to be falling apart, where most of what we feminists care about is under attack, it is important, I think, to remember the joys of struggle and the power we still have as women's studies professors to impact the lives of young people in unimaginable ways. As the Women's Center prepared for its anniversary celebration, two of the many testimonies we received from former students attest to what is possible in these extraordinary women's studies spaces. Tanya Gathers, for example, class of 2002, reflected on her time with us. As a student, she said, the Women's Center was a place where I was both politicized and nurtured. And if I needed to vent and gather my sister allies, it was that place too. Love was never lacking. Sisterhood was always plenty. The Women's Center is where I and so many others became Afro-Femme, and we say thank you. We will always return, love deeply, and uphold the spirit of the program. Sarah Thompson, class of 2006, and probably the most radical student government president Spelman ever had, recalled, I came to the Women's Center as a prospective student, and the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, the gender lens which was just lying on the table, caught my eye. As a high school senior, this was one of my first exposures to bold information about feminism, and my very first exposure to the words intersectional analysis. These two words, along with the words radical, African, and feminist, flew into my vocabulary and my life when I entered as a first-year student at Spelman. The faculty there energized me to organize, to join the dance of activist movements, and to create safe spaces in which to describe with new language who I was and what I was about. I would just say that Sarah is just returning from the occupied territories in Palestine and is working at a soup kitchen in California and keeps in very, very close contact with us. The greatest testament, I think, to the power of women's studies for me at Spelman was the April 2004 protest by students, mostly women's studies students, and members of our campus-based Feminist Majority Alliance against the negative portrayals of Black women in the rap music industry. Rap star Nelly was scheduled to come to campus in connection with a bone marrow drive. But after students saw his music video, Tip Drill, they demanded that he engage in a dialogue with students on the Spelman campus about his pornographic portrayals of young Black women. When he refused, they decided to hold a protest on campus anyway to bring attention to the more generic problem of misogyny in rap music video. I should say parenthetically that Nelly continues to lie about the circumstances surrounding the Spelman protest. In fact, a few months ago, he goes on television and says that he was disinvited to Spelman and blames Spelman students actually for the death of his sister to leukemia. In her June, and some of you may have seen that interview, and every time I see it, I just want to holler and scream. They did not disinvite Nelly. They asked Nelly to come and do his blood marrow drive, but also to talk to them about that video. Have any of you all seen Tip Drill? It used to be on at 3 o'clock in the morning at BET, so you know how terrible it is. In her June 4, 2004 article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, It's Getting Hot in Here, Elizabeth Farrell had this to say about the protesters at Spelman. Why did students at Spelman have such a strong reaction to the video? One explanation is that the campus has a unique environment. Out of 105 historically Black colleges in the U.S., Spelman is the only one with a women's studies major, which is amazing. I will say that I trot around to very many other historically Black colleges, and many other HBCUs are working on women's studies or gender studies minors, which I think is also the case at Albany State. Narratives of the development of women's studies almost never capture what faculty and students have been doing on Black college campuses. As women's studies continues to evolve and flourish, it is important, I think, to pause and reflect upon buried or forgotten histories, and there are many of them. The Nelly protest is just one. Without these alternative stories, and there are many, many more, it is nearly impossible, I would argue, to fully grasp how transformative women's studies has been in the lives of young women and men, including my own. It is also imperative that we imagine new futures for women's studies and ponder whether we are practicing what we preached nearly 40 years ago with respect to radically transforming the academy, improving the lives of women and girls, and bridging the disconnect between theory and practice. This is certainly what women's studies at Spelman has been attempting to do since 1981. I offer my best wishes to you as you continue on your important journey here at Albany State University as you craft the development of your own women and gender studies program. And I would be very happy to help you in any way that I can. Thank you. The women's studies students continue their activism on campus, and one of the targets of their activism right now is we have something called Market Friday every week, where vendors come and where disc jockeys come. And the music that's being played, you remember Market Friday. The music that's being played on Market Friday is continuing in the category of misogyny and being disrespectful to women. And so the students circulated a petition on campus to not to necessarily get rid of the disc jockeys and the music, but to have a process by which a committee of students will determine who will be the disc jockeys and what kind of music will be played. Now, ironically, this time, we're not in trouble with the administration, we're in trouble with other students. So there's a larger group of students at Spelman who are very unhappy with the young women who circulated the petition. And so this is a very ironic situation. But I should also say that during the Nellie protests, it was also the case that there were a small minority of students involved in the Nellie protests, whereas, you know, in the big public, people thought that that was Spelman students in general. So we have lots of work to do on our campuses. So that when really courageous, politically conscious students step out at our institutions to protest against misogyny in music, or, for example, to even protest against doing commencement at Eddie Long's mega church because of his blatant homophobia. When that happens, frequently the students who step out get in trouble, not so much with the administration, but with other students. So that's the trouble we're in right now. But they are serious, they are relentless, and I am going to imagine that by the end of the year, they will have put their plan in place, and that misogynistic, disgusting, toxic music will not be played every Friday afternoon from 2 until 5 o'clock, which also interferes with classes which are right next to, as you know, Market Friday. And also embarrasses people like me who, when guests come to the campus, they said, are you aware of the music that's coming into the Cosby Auditorium where you're trying to have programs to enter your class? We say, yes, we're very aware of it, and we're trying to do something about it. So that's the trouble that we're in right now, but it's good trouble. And I'm hoping that by September, the students can move on to something else, and we'll have solved that problem. So, yeah, there's a difference between institutional space and personal space. Difference between institutional space and personal space. So certain people have a right to play whatever they want to play in their personal space. But I can tell you how we were able to counter that argument with our students very quickly. We said, if you were at a majority institution, if you were at a white university, and every Friday, at something called Market Friday, students were playing racist, degrading music. They called black folk all kinds of bad names. Would you join a mobilization which said that people have a right to do that? And the answer was no. It was very interesting that when you flip the script to the argument about having to hear racist music in a majority setting, the students were able to hear another argument, which is that people don't have a right in institutional space to play hate stuff. And we put the kind of misogynistic, hateful music that was playing during Market Friday in the category of hate speech. Very much like any kind of racist music against any kind of racial ethnic group would fall into that category. And so that was that was how we were able to engage the debate that you would not want to hear. You would not want to hear toxic, racist music about any racial ethnic group in the U.S. every Friday, even though someone might argue, I have a right to play that music. So that made the debate much easier. And I would say the same thing about the N-word. I would say that any of us who are of a particular age in particular, or grew up in a particular part of the U.S., and understand the toxic and violent nature of institutionalized racism, which the N-word represents, would have a very, very hard time making the argument that it's all right to say that word and to hear it in institutional spaces on a regular basis, or the B word. I mean, you know, it's just like you younger people in the audience may know, and I don't know the rapper's name right now. I'm forgetting it. You remember the issue of Emmett Till? Who was that? Lil Wayne. That Lil Wayne sort of I don't even want to say innocently, I would say naively, naively made a reference to Emmett Till, which luckily was able to be fixed. I mean, anybody who knows and remembers the Emmett Till situation, and even if you weren't able to remember it, if you read about the Emmett Till situation, you would have a visceral reaction to the use of the saga of Emmett Till being used in that way. So I just think it's really, really important for us to remember our history and for us to say no to any kind of negative, disrespectful, toxic treatments of any of us as people of color generally and as women. And I am very happy that these young women and a few students from Morehouse, by the way, are determined that they're going to keep their mobilization up and not be subjected in institutional spaces to disrespectful, toxic images of us. Now, let me just say one thing. It is the case, by the way, that Spelman has a policy against what I just described in terms of the music, but the policy was not being paid any attention to. That is, the Spelman as an institution has a policy against DJs playing that kind of music. So that was another argument. That wasn't really my main argument. No, the Spelman does not have, and I'm going to say thankfully, even as an alum, Spelman didn't go the way of Morehouse by institutionalizing a dress code. And those of you who look very carefully at that dress code know that at the core of that dress code was angst about male students cross-dressing. Though, there were other things there, but that was, alumni came on campus, I just talk candidly, alumni came on Morehouse campus and noticed that there were a few, maybe 3, Morehouse students wearing skirts and carrying women's purses. And on the basis of that, instituted a dress code policy, which included some other things, but that was really what it was that alumni got upset about. Spelman has not instituted a dress code, which I would be very opposed to, remembering the rigid dress code that I was subjected to as a Spelman student between 1962 and 1966, where we could not even wear pants in the dorm room. In your own dorm room, let alone out in the world. So I think dress codes can be very, very problematic. The issue of hair is, I think, also complicated. But what I'm more interested in with young folk is engaging them in conversation. The misogynistic, toxic music in institutional space is quite another matter. But the issue of weaves and extensions and the like, I would be very opposed to a blanket institutional policy that prohibits that. What I am interested in on our campuses is engaging in dialogue with young women and men about the different worlds that we inhabit. I will say, though, that 2 of my black women friends came to Spelman. It's interesting you would ask that question last week from 2 other institutions, and they were very surprised at the number of weaves that they saw. They also noticed, this is very interesting, that as they moved around on the campus, generally they saw more weaves than they did among the students who inhabit the Women's Center, which I thought was very, very interesting. So I do think that there's a conversation to be had, and I think that I'm always prepared to hear from young women. One of the things that I say to the young women who come into my women's studies class, and this is a huge, contentious debate, when they make the argument they are expressing themselves, what I say to them is, you're following a gender script that you did not write. You're following a gender script that you did not write. You may think that you are expressing something that comes out of your individual brain, but in fact, you are in many ways having internalized a stripper culture that pervades popular culture and pervades of music videos. And so you may think that you imagine this yourself, but in the same way that if you go into if you go into the children's department and see the highly sexualized clothes that parents have to try to move away from because there's so much child pornography. Manufacturers make thongs for little girls. Make thongs for little girls, which is all about the hypersexualization of young girls. Now, do you think that young girls imagine a thong on their own? No. They get introduced to this by the fashion industry, and then they imagine that I decided that I would wear X and Y. So I think that that's a discussion that I like to have with young women and men. What set of circumstances led you to make these choices? And that conversation I have found is much more constructive with young people than a blanket, don't do this. But we should hear from a young person who may have an alternative point of view than what I just described. Students going to graduate school now will have some contact with feminist theory in their courses, English, history, social sciences. So women's studies is just an important interdiscipline in the academy because it has transformed most of the disciplines. We even have a biology of gender course. We need more feminist science studies, but we only have one. And then, of course, there are now almost 15 freestanding PhD programs in women's studies. And I want to just say that last year we graduated our first. One of our women's studies students who graduated 7 years ago got a PhD in women's studies from Rutgers University and is now teaching at Texas Women's University. So women's studies is despite its fragility, despite its limited economic resources, ideologically, philosophically, and pedagogically, the field is doing very well. And all over the world, actually. Women's studies is everywhere. Uganda, for example, had the first women's studies program on the African continent. That women's studies program has been going on for 30 years. So it's in China, it's in Uganda, it's in Norway, it's in Britain, it's everywhere. And for me, the interesting thing about the evolution of the field is its global reach and impact, and the ways in which we are increasingly having collaborations with women all over the world. Violence against women, for example, is one of the most urgent issues that enable women across all kinds of difference to mobilize. And so I would say that the field is doing well. What I would say at Spelman, and I don't know if that would be the case, the thing that I talk about the most when I stand up in places is the fact that it creates activists on campus. Whenever you hear about any agitation going on Spelman's campus, any mobilization, I guarantee you it will be the women's studies students. And why is that? Because they get courses where they get a fusion of theory and practice. And once you've been bitten with the women's studies bug, and once you begin to see things in the world that don't make sense, those are the students who are likely to agitate and to be activists. And so the other argument that I make when I go around to black colleges is that women's studies is an important site for the production of feminist activist students on your campus. And they do really good things. They also don't just do things outside of the campus. They also point out things that are on campus. But they are the ones who, when I think about what I would say is Spelman got the most national and international attention from the Nelly protests. Not from all the other kinds of things that we do, but from the Nelly protests. International filmmakers came to Spelman campus, and Byron Hurt, I don't know if you all have seen Beyond Beats and Rhyme, the documentary about hip-hop. Byron spent 2 days on the Spelman campus, and so that mobilization is made permanent in his documentary. And all kinds of people talked about those young women who had no media, whatever, went on. I was just I was just so happy. Went on CNN, went on all kinds of national media outlets talking about the Nelly protest, and they were amazing. They were amazing, and they brought a lot of positive attention to Spelman. In fact, they sort of created a mythology about Spelman because we got named as being one of the most activist campuses in the U.S. Well, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. But, and we continue to get students who come to Spelman because they see us as this radical feminist activist place, and then when they get there, they say, oh, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But so that's what else I talk about, that it really politicizes and nurtures students. And I mean, when I get back to campus next week, I mean, you know, they planned the Tony Caven-Barrett annual conference, and they will be in there. I mean, it's just amazing the work that they do. And then we do Denim Day, which is a anti-violence against women mobilization. They will be planning for that, and then we do Take Back the Night, which is anti-rape, and then they do the Day of Silence, which is in solidarity for LGBTQ people. So they are just on it, and I think that women's studies is the space on campus that motivates students not just to do well in their classes, but to actually operationalize the tagline that we now have, Women Who Change the World. And so that's another thing that I really like. And I would say that many women's studies programs in the academy have sort of dropped the activism part. But we continue to be committed to theory building and also activism.
Thank you so much. Thank you, both keynote speakers, for your wonderful, inspiring presentations.